Okay, let's get started. If we could. I just have a couple of announcements by way of business. First, the reason for the microphones is that this is being recorded, with your permission, of course, and the microphone helps with that. The other thing is, with respect to schedule, we are running a little bit of time, and I have agreed to eliminate the criticism part of my talk this afternoon, so what I have to say will stand alone and so we'll make up a little time there. But we will have Mila Versteeg participating by Skype in her next session, and that's on schedule. So let's start. So for this session, we have James Melton giving a piece he's recently written on Magna Carta, and it's, of course, the 800th anniversary of the writing of Magna Carta, or will be very shortly. So it's very propitious, and Dan Brinks commenting.
Okay, so thank you, everyone, and thank you to Dan and Zach for inviting me here. So the motivation behind my paper is that I've been asked to work on an edited volume with Robert Hazel, also from UCL, on the legacy of Magna Carta to commemorate its 800th anniversary next year. So that's sort of my motivation. And in the paper, I sketch out maybe some early ideas about how we might organize such a volume, and then also kind of my thoughts on a chapter I might be able to contribute to that volume. And I'm going to be presenting the latter today. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about the influence of Magna Carta on modern constitutions. And by modern constitutions, I mean all constitutions written from 1789 to sort of the present. Okay? So to get started, I want to talk about modes of influence. And I'm going to more or less ignore the examples in the table. You can read those as you like, because I think I'm on a little bit of thin ground with some of those examples. But the idea is that I want to separate out different types of influence on national constitutions. It's fairly easy to say that the Magna Carta has been influential and reference symbolic references to Magna Carta in the Federalist Papers or the Anti-Federalist Papers, or by constitutional drafters in other parts of the world. But it's much harder to pinpoint exactly what that influence is. So I'm separating influence into four categories that run across two dimensions. The first dimension is actual versus symbolic influence. And by actual, I mean influence on the text of the Constitution itself. So borrowing provisions from Magna Carta into modern constitutions. Now, you may think that's sort of a stretch, and it is, since the Magna Carta was written in Latin. But the idea is that some of the rights and whatnot found in Magna Carta have made their way into modern constitutions, and so tracing that sort of influence. By symbolic influence, I mean influence in terms of the principles set forth or kind of underlying Magna Carta, or perhaps underlying certain provisions in Magna Carta that have been used to justify things like constraints on government and constitutionalism in kind of modern constitutions. And along the other dimension, we have direct and indirect sources of influence. Direct means that people are actually referencing the Magna Carta. They're using that text. They're using the principles in the Magna Carta. Indirect means that there's some mediating document. So, for instance, the English Bill of Rights was highly influenced by Magna Carta, and it's been referenced by lots of constitutional drafters, just like Magna Carta has been. So that's sort of an indirect influence. Similarly, the United States Constitution we know was influenced by Magna Carta. And so any constitution that was later influenced by the United States Constitution, we can say was indirectly influenced by Magna Carta. That's the idea. And so what I talk about in the paper, and what I'm going to go on to talk about, is actual actual influence, and primarily actual indirect influence. Right? Most constitutional provisions aren't borrowing text directly from Magna Carta like some constitutions borrow text from each other in this modern era. Most of the time it's some wording of rights that are found in Magna Carta that are also found in the text of modern constitutions. So using the Comparative Constitutions Project data, I've identified 8 rights that were originally put in the Magna Carta. And they are protection from expropriation, right to examine evidence witnesses, jury trial, guarantees of due process, protection from false imprisonment, right to speedy trial, prohibition of unjustified constraint or habeas corpus, and freedom of movement. These are principles that are set forth in various articles in Magna Carta. And we could argue, and I suspect we will argue, over what rights are included on this list. So, for instance, one thing that's notably absent is anything about inheritance rights, where there was a lot of provisions in Magna Carta about inheritance and the special protection that widows and perhaps minors should have in this kind of ancient feudal system. Similarly, there's no mention of habeas corpus or any prohibition of unjustified restraint in Magna Carta. That's a principle that evolved in English law over time to enforce some of the provisions of Magna Carta. But that one's included and inheritance rights aren't. So in some ways this is an incomplete list. In other ways there's things in here that maybe shouldn't be. So that's something we can talk about. Just to talk a little bit about the analysis, it's very descriptive at this point. I want to emphasize the very early kind of thinking about this. But just from a descriptive standpoint, how many rights from Magna Carta of these 8 are typically found in national constitutions? And you can see the answer in the bar chart. It's 0. Of the 750 or so constitutions that we've coded, almost 250 of them have included none of the rights from Magna Carta in them. And the average number is only 2 out of those 8. There's only one constitution that, based on our records, that has included all 8 of these provisions, and that's Ghana's constitution from, I think it was 1969, and it was only enforced for like 3 years. Okay? So the bottom line is that not very many of these rights have made their way into modern constitutions. We can look at this more precisely by looking at specific rights, and I'm going to just highlight a couple of the rights here. Due process and jury trials. So in this figure, the solid line indicates the number of constitutions that we've coded in a given year, and the dashed line indicates the number of those constitutions that have the right specified in the slide. And the figure on the left is kind of zooms in on this very early constitutional era from 1789 to 1850, and then the figure on the right is the whole modern era. And so what we see quite commonly, actually, is that very early constitutional documents, those written from 1789 to roughly 1810, include lots of these Magna Carta rights, but then they sort of trail off in their significance, okay, and their importance and prevalence. And you can see that with due process. You can see that similarly with jury trial. There was a slight uptick in sort of 1825 or so, and then it leveled off again. And so those 2 rights that we most closely associate with Magna Carta aren't very common in constitutions. Now, I'm sure one criticism that I'll hear is that, well, pretty much all the nations in the world have some sort of version of jury trial. It's just not in their constitution. Yes, but I think it is important that it says something about the influence of Magna Carta if it's in constitutions versus in kind of ordinary law, or perhaps it's just some principle that's in the justice system that's not codified anywhere. And then just to kind of summarize, the red line now is other rights that were popular early on. Things like freedom of religion, freedom of expression, prohibition of ex post facto laws, and there's one other one, freedom of the press. So those 4 rights were in the U.S. Bill of Rights and in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, but they were not in Magna Carta. And so these are rights that we can consider popular in the early era, like some of those Magna Carta rights. And you can see that they're just about equal in prevalence up until about 1810 or 1815, and then the lines diverge, and those other rights have continued to grow in popularity, and are indeed quite popular in modern constitutions, those written today, versus the Magna Carta rights, which are only in about half of constitutions on average. So my main point so far, and let me again emphasize this is early research, is that this is the actual influence of the Magna Carta is, I think, a little bit tenuous. Instead, where I think Magna Carta has been influential is its symbolic influence. And in some ways, you can talk about Magna Carta as a motivation for codified constitutions more generally in the start of this whole codified constitutional era. So its symbolic influence is important. Its actual influence is less so in modern constitutions. And that's where I'll leave it. I look forward to the discussion.
Great. And Brinks.
Great. So I have just a couple slides I want to show you. One is, as I'm sure you all know, that the Houston Museum of Natural Science is hosting a copy of the Magna Carta starting today, appropriately enough. And I put this up because I read the paper as being a little bit more skeptical than James' concluding statement maybe made it sound, whereas here he kind of gave equal weight to symbolic importance versus actual, real importance or something. But in the paper he sounds a lot more skeptical to suggest that the Magna Carta really didn't matter all that much. It didn't matter initially, and it doesn't matter today. And the Houston Museum of Natural Science begs to differ. It's Great Britain's most valuable expert to the world. It's the definitive document modeling basic civil liberties. Is the source of many of the most fundamental concepts of law, and so on. So, you have a lot of people to persuade, I guess. But anyway, I like the project. Sometimes our most interesting projects sort of come to us this way. People say, well, why don't you do something about this? And then once you think about it, it turns out to be really interesting. I think it is really interesting. And what I'm going to do today is maybe do more suggesting ways to nuance the project or complicate the project, and then you can do whatever you want. But it seems like, to me, some of the more interesting questions weren't addressed, or in fact, the one that to me seemed most interesting comes up one sentence in the conclusion, which is about sort of different regional patterns and different moments and how those two are associated. So let me not be too cryptic and start from the beginning, which is more or less where you started. The project tracks the appearance in modern constitutions of different rights that were present in Magna Carta, and it compares the appearance. So the focus is really on this, on the direct sort of material effect of these rights on current constitutional texts. And you spend a fair amount of time sort of laying out this grid, material, or you don't use material.
That's a much better word, though.
Is it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I'll tell you where I got that. Cesar Rodriguez Garavito, who's already been mentioned once, tries to trace the effect of constitutional court decisions in Colombia, and he uses the same scheme, right? Material, symbolic, direct, indirect. And it's useful for thinking about it, for thinking about the problem, because it expands our imagination beyond looking for textual references. But in another way, I find it less useful, because once we've expanded our imagination, we kind of ignore the 2x2 altogether. And we just start, so when you said, my goal is to kind of separate out these different ways in which the Magna Carta has influenced, that's not how it reads, really, your paper. Right, and so I'm not sure what to do about that. I think, for me, 2x2 tables that are useful and helpful and that actually do a lot of work in a paper are 2x2 tables that sort of line up with some theoretical intuition or something that help us explain something, right? So that the diagonals mean something, or something, something that suggests that there's work to be done by this conceptual framework. And what you're doing is just saying, really, we need to think beyond just textual influences, or maybe you're not. But it seemed like that took too much space in your paper. And I think you could very quickly say, look, here are the things that you could be looking for when you look at influences. I'm going to grant the Houston Museum of Natural Science that this is a big, important symbolic document. But what I'm interested in is whether it actually affects the text of current constitutions, and then you could just move on. That's really a really minor point. But the main point I want to make is related to this, about the difference between the myth of the Magna Carta and its actual textual provisions. It turns out, and you point this out, that if we were going to prescribe Magna Carta as a recipe against arbitrary government or absolutist government, it would be a medicine that's been tried and didn't work, right? I mean, the barons were barely out of London when the king was already saying, I'm not really going to be bound by this, and and it didn't really work to do the work that people thought it was going to do. So it's hard to imagine why it would be a role model. It's sort of like taking a medicine that didn't work the last time. But in a way, I think that the way I think of influence and the way I think of sort of the diffusion of constitutional texts or constitutional ideas or constitutional rights is not so much that people take them because they were in Magna Carta, right? But that people take them because they think they're going to be useful in achieving some sort of political goal, right? And so for that, so it would be, for example, evidence of the influence, at least of the myth of the Magna Carta, if dictators said, I don't want anything that looks like Magna Carta in my constitution, right? And so if dictators fear Magna Carta and Democrats embrace it, then that would be evidence of Magna Carta's influence. And it might, depending on what the mix of dictatorships and democracies is at any given moment, your line graph wouldn't show that, right? It wouldn't reflect it. It would, right? So I think when I, so for just to give one more example, when I think of the influence of particular textual provisions in Latin American constitutionalism, the notion that property has a social function to perform, right? It's not that everybody's going to put that in their constitution. It's that the people who want to leave some space for redistribution are going to grab a hold of that language and put it in their constitution, hoping to use it as a lever later on, right? But people who don't want property to be subject to redistribution are going to resist it and are not going to put it in, right? And so so this leads me to some of the historical patterns, and I'm sort of, again, treading on thin ice here because I'm really not a historian, but most of the historians didn't show up, so maybe I'm okay. The right to examine evidence and witnesses is a right it's in some ways quite peculiar to the common law, right? Because the common law assumes an oral, open kind of show at the end of some period of discovery in which you would bring everybody into the room and have a confrontation and so on. Whereas the civil law world doesn't imagine criminal trials that way at all, right? It imagines them as a slow, methodical investigation in which you build a file, right? And there's no moment of confrontation, right? So when you look at the moments in your historical progression, you have a raft of constitutions that follows on the disintegration of the Spanish Empire, right? The independence of Latin America, and so on. And there's no perceptible effect because all the civil law constitutions they don't have space for a confrontation with your witnesses in a way. I mean, they do, but in a different way, right? And so they're not going to look to the Magna Carta for a model. They're going to look to, the French model.
Which they did.
Which they didn't. Okay.
No, they did.
Which they did.
Yeah.
Okay, right. And then when the British Empire starts to fall apart, right, and you start to write post-colonial constitutions in Africa or whatever, then maybe, you get this uptick in the right to confront the witnesses against you and the right to examine evidence and so on, right? So, in a way, the story is not, well, Magna Carta should matter because it's Magna Carta. Magna Carta should matter to people who want to achieve the goals that the myth of the Magna Carta represents, right? And so I think you need to disaggregate a little bit who is doing the copying and maybe build that into your into your whole paper rather than just have it as a sort of for future research thing at the end. So the civil law really depends on an examining magistrate and doesn't look to the defendant or the accused, to evaluate the evidence and so on. Whereas everybody's afraid of the king's greed, right? And so interestingly here, let me see if I can, does this work? I guess not. Anyway, on the left-hand side, again, you have this, the moment when the Spanish Empire constitutions came about, and I don't know about the rest of the world, so I'm just going to talk about the post-Spanish and the post-British one. But I'm sure there's a lot of other stuff going on. But, you know, if you look from 1800 to 1820, right, that's a moment up to the 1820s when in Latin America, for example, a lot of the new constitutions were really quite, authoritarian, or what Grail calls conservative in nature, right? So there's a lot of latitude given to the executive. There's not very much protection. But then shortly after that, you have this sort of compact between the conservatives and the liberals, which begins around 1820, right? And that's when they start grabbing a hold of the sorts of rights that the Magna Carta represents, rights to a more limited government, less arbitrary rule, the protection of property, protection of individual autonomy, and so on. And so, in a way, that seems to track that. You know, so again, if you sort of tease out who's doing the borrowing, you might find that there's actually more influence than you suggest in the paper. And that, to me, would be really interesting. So I would really encourage you to sort of move it in that direction if you can. How much more time?
About a minute.
About a minute. Good. So the other suggestion, and maybe this is too much or not what you want to do, and here I'm much less confident that this is something you ought to do even. But there's another way in which there's the sort of the negative example version of diffusion, right? So if Magna Carta did spectacularly fail in some ways, right? Were people aware of the reasons why? So, is there a sort of literature about what was missing from Magna Carta, or what went too far in Magna Carta, or what were the fatal flaws in Magna Carta? And is there a way in which you could trace the lessons of the Magna Carta into future constitutions? And in that sense, it wouldn't be Magna Carta itself necessarily that is doing the work, but it would be the example of, or the Magna Carta in historical context, right, that is doing the work. And I don't know if you can tease that out, but, I saw, for example, editorials in the Dominican Republic when they were considering reforms to their constitutional court that said, whatever we do, let us not fall into the trap that Costa Rica fell into, And so that's evidence of diffusion and learning, right? But it's not, but you wouldn't get it by looking for similarities, right? And so I don't know if you can do that, if there's a conventional wisdom about what was wrong with Magna Carta that you could look for traces of. But that, again, seems to me would be really interesting. And then I just have one little quibble about how you classify the rights. And that is, there's a right, I forget the textual version of it now, but something about the right to, you call it the right to examine evidence and witnesses, but something about the bailiff can't accuse you without bringing forth evidence or something, or, subject you to law somehow without, on the bailiff's own word. Right. Or it's not the bailiff, it's somebody, the sheriff, maybe it is the bailiff. Anyway, it's like essentially the prosecutor can't charge you with a crime absent producing some evidence. And to me that seems like a precursor to our right to a grand jury rather than the right to examine evidence and witnesses against you. Because it just says that the state can't charge you with a crime until it's actually produced evidence that goes beyond just the opinion of the prosecutor. That there has to be something there before you can be even charged with a crime. So anyway, that's just a quibble. But
or the freedom from unjustified restraint. Often that's a phrase.
Right.
Modern constitutions.
Yeah. So a sort of a right to probable cause in a way, right? Before the state can even begin to come after you. Anyway, so those are my comments. In general, I think it's a really interesting project, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it develops.
Well, great. So now we're going to turn to our paragons of self-restraint on the left for some quick comments. And I thought I'd remind you that if you give a very quick comment, you can certainly go back in the question period to elaborate that. So anyway, start here. Q.
All right. So if the analysis is just about the content of Magna Carta rights and how they're reflected in contemporary constitution, then I would have been somewhat skeptical and may have seen this as a thinly veiled attempt by British intellectuals to glorify Magna Carta or something. But you have a table that showed an actual increase in mentions of Magna Carta. This is Brazilian Constitutional Assembly. And one of the papers that is coming later has a case in which Magna Carta is featured prominently. So there's something there, and I'm wondering why that might be. And is it a part of an effort to ground contemporary human rights principles in some kind of local traditions? And if that's the case, would you see something different if you go to Asia and look at the debate there? Maybe there's an increase in reference to Confucius text. If you go to other parts of the world, you might find reference to the Code of Hammurabi, which presumably has some provisions about presumption of innocence and the right to examine evidence and so on. So if you look at Bible too in this analysis, if you look at other parts of the world, just focus on that particular region, do you expect something like that? Sort of like Hobbes-Bohmian invention of tradition kind of thing going on with human rights ideas.
So people keep stealing my comment, but so here's another one before I get a chance to say it. I was wondering, did it have any influence on British law? Like, is it a local phenomena, or is it irrelevant there as well? Or is the way you would measure it in Britain different from the way that you're measuring it abroad?
I also have a problem like that with the distinction between actual and symbolic. And I want to point out in your paper, when you are tracing the actual, you do it at a different level of analysis because you look at the rights, and the symbolic point, it's a structural thing. So I wonder whether you could trace the influence of the due process clause, because in page 7 you rapidly get rid of the mediation problem, and I wonder whether the due process idea that gets into the U.S. Constitution, it's ideationally totally different conceptually from the one in British law, in a sense, or it's so there you might be looking at another symbolic influence, but not at the structural level as you do in your paper, at the level of the actual rights.
So whatever happened to the other charter, which was contemporaneous and had to do with rights of the commons and the commoners, given where the world is today, that may be of much more interesting than this charter.
I wonder if you could explain what the implications are of this. It's not clear to me what the difference is, why it matters, whether constitutions have followed the Magna Carta or not.
So let's see, following on, first of all, by the way, Taib and Courtney, really very nicely succinct. They win the award that I mentioned earlier. I think, I'm not the judge and jury, but let's see. So following on prior two panels, I think the idea is to go to the audience and get some more comments, and then we'll come back to James. Okay, Robert. And raise your hand, let me know, and I'll put you on the list if you want to make a comment.
So I have this sort of partly an empirical question as much as anything else, which is, so, assuming you have the sort of correct list of rights from Magna Carta, to what extent do those rights cluster in constitutions? Because, part of the problem here, right, is if we're thinking about sort of what the influence is of a document, influence can sort of take a lot of different forms. So one, I think, reasonable question is, what's the reasonable expectation for influence? And if those sort of 8 or whatever rights all kind of travel together as a package, that strikes me as sort of, at least some evidence that people are really reading Magna Carta closely and sort of know what's in it and are kind of taking what's in there. If they don't travel, that doesn't mean they're not influential. As sort of Professor Brinks brought up, it might be that sort of pieces of the Magna Carta were viewed as more successful than others, and those were being taken and others were being ignored. But I think sort of understanding how those rights cluster and whether or not they move as a package or not, or in the ways they do or don't, would sort of be an interesting way to start thinking about what the reasonable expectation is for influence, what kinds of influence we're thinking about. and that sort of thing.
I also think that there's such a thing as the, like in literary theory, as the anxiety of influence. And, you know, that's something that comes out of like Harold Bloom. But the idea is that to the extent that a charter is dominant, then you may not have a vibrant movement that takes for instance, a local indigenous movement that takes you out beyond the language of a precursor. So a nation could not be establishing its own identity. So like a colonial situation, you know, they may just lift whole portions of the text and put it there. But really, then the text becomes a means of maintaining a dominant influence. So Bloom was looking for strong poets that went outside of the language, created their own language, you know, it gets back to the discussion that we had a few minutes ago. The whole Western model, the dominant model, seems to be this neoliberal type of. What is it historically that has limited the contours of constitutions and everything to keep them within a dominant model or a dominant paradigm?
Okay. Anything else from the audience? Okay, let's. James, why don't you continue and respond to what's been said?
Mm-hmm. And I think I want to start with Courtney's question. And why does it matter? Why is this important? So my answer to that is I think that in some ways this is part of our larger project with SAC about this historiography of rights. How do these rights come about? How do they evolve? How do they get translated from constitutions very early on that had a handful of rights to now constitutions that have 60 plus distinct rights in them, right? So you can look at Magna Carta in one sense as, yes, this is a doctrine of rights. It has, the original one had something like 63 articles. And you can look at these very kind of specific rights. Most of them didn't take off, right? Most of them were taken out of force from English law almost immediately. But there's a couple that kind of hung on and have evolved over time and become much better articulated. And I think that's really interesting, understanding that process and how that actually occurred. And then looking at that, the influence of Magna Carta on subsequent bills of rights, the English Bill of Rights, French Declaration of the Rights of Man, U.S. Bills of Rights, and how that this expansion of rights in a way. So in some sense, what was in the Magna Carta was very specific to what was going on in England at the time. And it was also very, some of the ideas are very simple in there. They're not these broad rights that we have today, right? So how do we move from this very simple kind of idea of what a right is to kind of these broad rights that we have today? And even, and I guess one of Dan brings up kind of what's the achievement of the Magna Carta, or perhaps what's wrong with the Magna Carta. The achievement is largely that, based on what I've read so far and what I can tell, is that some of these things were put in more general terms, and that's what's significant about it, right? So some of these rights were guaranteed to all persons, okay? Like the freedom of movement is a good example of that. The same with sort of the legal process rights. And so that shift in thinking is what makes Magna Carta important. The problems with the Magna Carta are that there's no enforcement mechanism for most of those protections. That's why you see the evolution of habeas corpus in English law that translates then into the U.S. and in constitutions all over the world today, right? So that's maybe an example of something that's omitted from Magna Carta, and you can see the influence of Magna Carta in that omission, right? So I think that's interesting kind of to think about it from that perspective. I agree that the 2x2 is not very helpful, and thank you for the movement to material rather than actual. I was struggling to come up with something to talk about that. In some sense, that whole discussion is prefaced on my very early reading of this humongous literature on Magna Carta, where lots of people talk about influence, but they're very vague in the way that they do so. And so starting to, maybe not for this paper necessarily, it's not useful, but in terms of like an introduction to an edited volume, pushing those contributors to think about the specific modes of influence. And maybe that 2x2 is not the right way to do that, but that's kind of the impetus for that, in a way. And in terms of all your comments about kind of thinking about contextually where Magna Carta is mattered, how it's mattered, having a theory of why Magna Carta matters, that's where the paper needs to go, I agree. And thinking about where, is it something about democracies versus dictatorships? Is it something about civil versus common law? I suspect there's certainly a civil common law distinction, right? What I think is really interesting is, so if you look at early constitutions, you look at constitutions written in the German states, written in Scandinavia, they don't have a lot of rights in them early on. But then you see this explosion in Latin America, right? So you have these early Latin American constitutions that have far more rights than the European constitutions, which is interesting. But the way that they chose is also interesting, right? So like a lot of constitutions are modeled very explicitly after the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. And those rights have stuck around in Latin America and made their way into kind of the constitutions written in the middle and kind of towards the end of the 19th century in Europe, right? And so the influence of why they chose which rights they did and how that translated and then diffused back into Europe is, I think, interesting in a way, right? And so this is something I'm just starting to explore, and I think that understanding how Magna Carta kind of plays into that is I think will be interesting, because it could be, and what I suspect has happened, at least with these kind of, at this very macro level, is that those rights got left out of Latin American constitutions in a way, and then they never got picked up again, right? Until, and this is kind of the story of Magna Carta, and something that we'll talk about in this book, is that there was a very kind of prolific, I think he was a lawyer, but he worked in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the UK. And I've talked to some people here about this already, and he essentially wrote every single decolonization constitution. And the set of rights in those constitutions is almost identical, right? And some of them, they are identical. And he was a huge proponent of the Magna Carta, okay? So you see this shift, and that's perfectly, that figure you put up there perfectly points this out. As these countries decolonize, you see this one guy's influence in some ways in national constitutions around the world, right? And so if you plot the similarities of all the constitutions in the world to, let's say, the UN Declaration of Rights of Man, if you plot their bills of rights, the correlations are just like in a straight line, right? They're all identical. You can see it very clearly, which is interesting. Okay. And the last point I want to make, and Zach, am I out of time?
I don't think so.
No. Is any focus on Magna Carta is in some ways completely arbitrary, right? Why is it arbitrary? Well, you can trace the principles of Magna Carta all back to very early Anglo-Saxon laws. A lot of the articles were set forth in Henry I's charter in 1100. Similarly, there's other documents in Europe that say almost the same thing as the Magna Carta, right? So there's the Golden Bull in Hungary of like 1222. There's constitutions written in Italy and in Spain, and there's similar charters in France and some of the German republics. So why do we focus on Magna Carta? And this is something that I don't think has adequately been answered. Why do we focus on Magna Carta and not those other laws, right? The Golden Bull in Hungary is very famous there, right? They call it Hungary's Magna Carta. But why is it Hungary's Magna Carta and not England's Golden Bull, right? So why is that the case? So I think that's something that's interesting to explore as well. So I'll leave it with that.
Okay. Good. I think that last point is just utterly fascinating to think about those counterfactuals and what documents could have been Magna Carta, or at least take the import of them. Okay, so we actually do have a minute or two left in this session. Cindy, you wanted to?
Control for what constitutions look like before and after the Magna Carta. So you're writing the history of something through the lens of something that exists centuries later. So, there's sort of a weird historical choice that is made by looking for the influence of the Magna Carta in constitutions. So, it's not just that the influence might be expressed, it's that the form and the structure, the object itself might be formed out of it. So I wonder if you could, frame some of these questions more looking, or at least acknowledging that, this comes at a time when what your lens is evaluating hadn't even existed yet.
Can I add something that just take the prerogative of the chair to add another thing to that? I mean, one of the interesting things about this is that it's 800 years, and to read a document that was written 800 years ago is kind of in some ways heroic. And I think one thing in the paper that it would be interesting to see is just, some of the language in that sense. And I think, you can imagine that the ratio of people who reference, or the number of references to the Magna Carta, and whether or not the referee had actually read the document is probably the highest ratio of any document you can imagine. And so it's not the fact that anyone's actually reading it, but if you were to read it, A, is that possible 800 years later? And is it the fact that there are some expressions, some written expressions that have made their way into other constitutions originally written in English, at least, perhaps translated? And it would be interesting to see if there's some terms and labels and neologisms that came out of that conceptual framework, which have hung on in kind of a very powerful way. So,
can I add a little bit to that? There was recently an exhibition at the Ransom Center on the influence of the King James Version of the Bible on American English, and common expressions and literature and all different spaces. And that seems like the kind of exercise you're doing, and I wonder if there's not already a well-developed sort of disciplinary regime for doing that in whatever discipline that comes out of. I don't even know what it is.
No, the Bible seems like a nice analog for this in some ways. All right, so that's it. Thank you, John.